the Galaxy Z Fold 3, and it's now been out and in the wild for over 2 months, and so I figured it was about time to share my thoughts on it. Now for context, I did a long-term review of the Fold 2 earlier this year, and since receiving the Fold 3, I've been comparing the two devices quite a bit to really assess how things have improved, if at all. And as I alluded to in my unboxing and first impressions video, there are really only 3 main changes that have been made to the Fold 3. The cover display, this under display camera, and finally the software. Pretty much everything else has stayed the same. And so with that in mind, I'm going to try and assess whether those 3 changes are worth their weight in gold. But before we do that, let's quickly cover off how this device is similar to the Fold 2. Firstly, the design. Aside from the slightly different colorway here, the Fold 3 not only looks, but also feels very similar to the Fold 2. It's still got that super beautiful frosted finish on the back, a really premium hinge mechanism, and the same size displays on both the front and inside of the device. We've also still got that blazingly fast capacitive fingerprint sensor on the side, which also acts as the power button. And whilst the look of the camera module has changed a little bit, the cameras themselves are the exact same as the ones found on the Fold 2. And then aside from this under display camera on the main display, the only real change build-wise is that the Fold 3 is now actually IPX8 water resistant, which is really impressive. But aside from that, like I said, this device looks and feels pretty much identical to the Fold 2. That means no changes to the crease, no changes to the form factor, and so a pretty familiar experience if you've ever used the Fold 2. Now, as mentioned, the cameras are the exact same as the ones found on the Fold 2. And in my review of that device, I actually said that those cameras reminded me of the ones found on Samsung's early 2020 flagship phones, which is before they made all of their big image processing improvements like what we started seeing with the Note 20 Ultra and beyond. And so accordingly, I've kind of been a bit disappointed with the cameras on the Fold 3. Don't get me wrong, you can still capture a decent image or video using this device, but it just leaves a little bit to be desired in regards to processing. Photos generally have that overly sharpened look to them, and portrait photos are really not up to snuff when you compare the results to other flagships on the market. And so I'm not really too sure what the limitation was here in regards to updating the cameras on the Fold 3 to match those found on Samsung's other 2021 flagship devices, but hopefully we see the next version of the Fold shipping with upgraded cameras all around. In terms of battery life, this has been another pretty disappointing aspect of the Fold 3. And for me, I've had to recharge it by around 7 to 8 PM pretty much every single day since I started using it. It's definitely not a full day performer, and in fact, I'd say that the battery life is actually a bit of a downgrade compared to the Fold 2. Now, it does have a slightly smaller battery compared to the Fold 2, but I think what's actually the bigger contributor here is this cover display. So as mentioned, one of the big improvements with the Fold 3 over last year's Fold 2 is that this cover display has gotten a refresh rate increase from 60 Hz all the way up to 120 Hz. And whilst of course this is going to have a knock on battery life, I think the benefit of having 120 Hz is actually worth it. With the Fold 2, there was this jarring contrast anytime you went from using the beautiful, silky smooth inner display that had a 120 Hz refresh rate to then using the cover display that was locked at 60 Hz, and switching back and forth between the two refresh rates as often as you do with a device like this just made me never want to use the cover display. And so for me, this is up there with one of the best upgrades they've made with the Fold 3 this year. I've honestly found myself using this cover display much more often than what I did with the Fold 2, and whilst it's still a bit too thin for a lot of tasks like typing and reading articles with small text, it's just a lot nicer to use thanks to the 120 Hz upgrade. Now, another change they've made is the addition of this under display camera on the main inner display. So on last year's Fold 2, we had your standard hole punch cutout for the selfie camera, but Samsung have decided to jump on board the under display camera train here by including one on the Fold 3. And it's not that good. Like, you can really see the pixels on top of this selfie camera in pretty much every single scenario and from every single angle. And for me, when I compare it to the pretty impressive under display camera on the ZTE Axon 30, the difference is just night and day. I'm actually really surprised Samsung wasn't able to do a better job with this one, and the fact that the selfie camera itself is a measly 4 megapixels doesn't make the situation much better as well. Obviously, we still have the same pretty solid hole punch selfie camera on the cover display, so I'm not too upset about the quality of images from this under display camera. I'm just a bit underwhelmed with how obvious all of these pixels are from pretty much any viewing angle. Now, I mentioned that the 120Hz cover display upgrade was good, but the other upgrade that gives that one a run for its money is the software. On the surface, things feel pretty similar to last year's Fold 2, but there are quite a number of improvements they've made just slightly below the surface that have actually had a huge impact on usability. So for reference, here are the complaints I made about the software in my review of the Fold 2. Firstly, apps completely quitting whenever you close the device. Secondly, some apps like Instagram not being optimized for the larger display. And thirdly, how the camera app defaulted to taking super tall and super thin photos whenever you captured images using the cover display. And by golly, it's like Samsung took that video and showed it to their software development team, because literally each of these complaints has been addressed. So if you go into your display settings and then navigate down to this continue apps on cover screen menu, here you can manually toggle any app you want to stay opened when you close the device, and it'll do exactly that. Now, not every app is supported, but most apps are, and this has been a pretty welcome improvement in terms of user experience. And then if we go back into our settings menu and navigate down to the advanced features menu and then the lab section, there's now this option here called customize app aspect ratios. So if any app does not support the custom aspect ratio of that inner display, which is still the case with Instagram, believe it or not, you can now find the app in this menu and change the aspect ratio to full screen, which will essentially force it to fill that main inner display. And for the most part, this feature works really well. Now, it's not flawless, and you will find that some parts of the UI are sometimes cut off because of this unorthodox approach, but I really like that Samsung have taken things into their own hands by adding in this feature themselves. And then, as I said, Samsung also made the really simple but super obvious change to the camera app so that it now defaults to the much more standard 3:4 aspect ratio for photos instead of that super silly full aspect ratio that was selected by default on last year's Fold 2, which resulted in some really tall and thin images. Aside from that though, like I said, it's largely the same software experience compared to the Fold 2. We do of course now have support for S Pen use, and I do actually have the new S Pen Pro, which is fun to use when you remember to take it with you, but because it's not built into the device like it is with Samsung's Note lineup, I just rarely find myself using it. But here's the thing, aside from the cover display, I feel like Samsung could easily port all of these new software features to the Fold 2, and for the price a lot of people paid for that device, they probably should. Now, that of course doesn't mean they will, and in fact, they probably won't, but it does kind of feel like Samsung have played it very safe with this year's Fold 3, when they perhaps could have taken things to another level altogether. In this current form factor, I'd actually say that the Fold 3 feels like a pretty well-rounded device. And honestly, aside from perhaps some additional optimization here and there and improvements to the camera system, there's not a lot more that can be done to improve this device. I think for me, the biggest change I'm looking for with this lineup is one that makes using the device feel more like a regular phone when it's closed. That means a slightly wider, more standard aspect ratio for the cover display, perhaps a slightly thinner build to make it more comfortable in the hand when closed, and as I said, a suite of flagship cameras to go with to ensure you're not having to sacrifice on image quality when switching to this lineup of devices. Because for me, as with any product that has been out and in the wild for a few years, that initial shock and awe factor that comes from using a foldable device for the first time, it's largely past. Now all I want is a device that doesn't feel like a step backwards in comparison to other flagship phones, which is kind of the case with the Fold 3. For now, whilst it's been super fun using the Fold 3 over the past little while, I'll be honest, I'm somewhat relieved to be moving on to the next, more regularly sized device. I'll be checking out the Z Flip 3 soon, and of course the Pixel 6 devices, which I'm super excited about. And so whilst I can appreciate the changes and improvements Samsung have made with their third iteration of the Fold lineup, it's still not quite that fully fledged phone replacement I've been looking for.